The deathly cold light from the monitor filled the room with a pale glow, illuminating only the keyboard, mouse, and the player's narrow face from the darkness. Staring at the screen, on which the title of a game about a world that had long ago forgotten how to forgive mistakes was burned in coal black letters. Behind the thin wall, someone was laughing quietly at the light stream and making noise with dishes, and the drums of the main menu beat in a dull echo in the headphones, as if counting down yet another sleepless night that the player voluntarily devoted to the game, which had already dragged on for 12 years. The cursor slid slowly over familiar points, reflected in the player's flickering pupils, and in the dim glass of the monitor, his own silhouette looked like a ghost, stuck to this corner of the room and to the screen as firmly as to the number of attempts that had crossed 200. The name of the character from the previous run, long doomed to another bad ending, was flashing on the panel below, and the player's fingers automatically twitched towards the continue button. But something in the player's chest creaked reluctantly, as if over the years even stubbornness had worn out and become rusty. The player's memory recalled the voice of a close relative who had been fiddling around nearby during the day, lazily tapping on his phone, calling this game the most pointless of all possible hobbies, but at the same time not stopping to chat about its hidden mechanics. A close relative then, squinting from the brightness of the monitor, suggested changing the usual route and, instead of another serious attempt to complete the game for real, organizing a crazy run for pure entertainment, as if he was offering a dare to step off a cliff into the black water. The words about not playing seriously first echoed in the player's mind with a dull rebound, like the impact of a blade on a too thick shield. But the longer the player's gaze slid over the gray menu, the more strongly the emptiness under the ribs responded to the same tired agreement that had long since covered the world outside the window. The selection carriage stopped at the new game option, and a short click of the mouse cut through the silence of the room, like a tiny shot of the start before a marathon, the outcome of which was already known, but still made the player's heart beat a little faster. The screen went dark, replaced by a dim screensaver with a broken world drowned in ash and smoke, and then, almost without transition, all reality narrowed down to a window with tables of characteristics, where the numbers honestly demonstrated the usual path to failure. In front of the player lay neat lines of strength, dexterity, endurance, magic, and other parameters, written in pale font, and each of them demanded attention, like a hungry mouth waiting for its share of the distributed points accumulated over 200 attempts. The player's hand trembled over the mouse, clinging to the old habit of smearing points in neat portions across all the lines. But somewhere in the depths of consciousness, a thought lazily stirred. If this race isn't about efficiency anyway, then maybe it makes sense to at least make it truly insane. The player recalled mocking messages in the chat from a friend who liked to create ridiculous builds for laughs and spectacle, and caught himself doing so. That for the first time in many years, it is not striving for perfect balance, but simply wants to see how far it can go by mocking the system. The cursor wavered, and then in one smooth motion dropped to the line hidden below. Hidden weapon mastery, where among several gray words assigned denoting swordsmanship talent gleamed dimly. Clicking on this option opened a small window, reminiscent of a long-forgotten secret, accessible only to those who have already broken the game halfway through, and symbols flashed on the screen, denoting the path of a man who dedicated himself to the blade to the last drop of his strength. All the available points, accumulated over hundreds of hours, slowly flowed into one narrow line, and dry numbers of power, stamina, and magic were one after another reset to pitiful units, while next to the sword's parameter, a simple word lit up in scarlet letters, promising the maximum. As the sliders moved, the player's reflection in the dim glass became slightly distorted, as if he himself were not moving from his chair. I walked further and further in the direction where after each decision there would be no turning back and no room for common sense. When the distribution was finished, the screen flickered for a second and was replaced by a status window where dull units stretched down in a long column, like lists of debts, and among them, like a lonely fragment, shone an indicator that had transformed from an ordinary number into a P carved in stone. Following the numbers, a model of the game character appeared, barely able to hold a simple sword in his hands. His emaciated body seemed to sag under the weight of too heavy steel, and every line on his face hinted that a gust of wind could knock him down as badly as a blow from a sledgehammer. The player involuntarily chuckled, looking at this pathetic semblance of a hero, and mentally admitted that I wouldn't even create such an avatar in a normal run. But on this night, given over to an absurd experiment, a special honesty appeared in the strange ugliness of the build. For a second, a system warning flashed in the right corner of the screen, that such distributions make the game practically unbeatable, and suggested going back and reviewing everything. But the player's finger almost without thinking slid towards the decline option, as if the habit of arguing with the system had become a part of him. The next window popped up with a sharp jerk, spreading lines of text over the model, and the imaginary echo of other people's voices rang out in the silence of the room. It was as if someone invisible was standing behind the player's chair and watching with interest interest this strange choice that no one had made before. Words about higher powers somewhere above this dead world being surprised by the unprecedented pattern of abilities floated before the player's eyes. And the reward line made the player's heart pound against their ribs a little harder, as if the game had fleetingly shown a tiny glimmer of hope in the merciless difficulty ceiling. The new skill appeared in the status as a thin, shining line, and the short description hidden under the title trembled slightly. Before opening up to the full text, where behind the high-flown phrases one could clearly feel the monstrous difference between an ordinary player and a legend of mythical proportions. The skill rating, marked by an exorbitant number of characters, stood out from all the usual boundaries, as if someone outside the game code had deliberately added another one. A step alien to the system, and next to it, on a separate line, a small, almost innocent indicator of the activation cost per second glowed dimly. The player's eyes automatically slid down the window to his own mana bar, and saw a modest unit frozen under the dim division. He felt the absurdity of the character he had created take shape into something almost grotesque, like a joke told in a voice that was too serious. The result was a person capable of touching the limit of mastery for only 1/100th of a second, and the mind of the habitual player immediately began to throw out mathematical scenarios, trying to calculate whether such a moment would be enough to cut the throat of the game itself. While the player was thinking, his hand reached for the phone, lying on the table next to a mug of cold coffee, and his fingers quickly clicked off a couple of photos of the screen, trying to capture that impossible combination of numbers before something breaks or disappears, as undocumented features are wont to do. The message to a friend flew away almost automatically, taking with it a blurry photo of the status window and a short phrase about it. That the game finally recognized someone's stubbornness as worthy of a mythical gift, while preserving in the subtext that tired pride that is not usually spoken out loud. The answers poured in as quickly as the blows to the player's character had fallen in unsuccessful attempts. And behind the short remarks of surprise, envy, and silent ellipses, one thing was clear. None of the remaining fanatics of this dead project ever dared to take their obsession to such a limit. The player briefly imagined the graph lines. Millions of players who dropped out of the game many years ago, and a thin, almost invisible curve of a few dozen stubborn ones, clinging to an impossible ending, as if to a final argument in a dispute with their own world, where there was also no fair ending. Instead of returning to the editor and saving the build with moderate edits, the player took a deep breath, as if he was about to step onto the cold stone of the battle arena, and simply confirmed the continuation, allowing the game to record all the mistakes made as something final. The screen briefly flickered to black, but instead of the expected introductory video, the world on the other side of the glass suddenly burst into an indecently bright light. It was as if someone had turned on a spotlight right in my eyes, and behind the monitor panel something quietly cracked in the very structure of the familiar darkness of the room. The player woke up in a new body and realized that he was inside the game again. The sound of the system unit's fans became distorted, as if someone else's breath had penetrated, and the night air around the chair became thick and heavy, filling with an electric premonition, similar to a thunderstorm that usually rumbles somewhere very close outside the window. But this time the thunder came from inside his skull. The last letters of the system message, appearing against the blinding background, barely managed to form a phrase about a cross-border, challenging the impossible and how myths sometimes pull at the sleeves of those who are too persistent in not believing in them. Then these words dissolved into a rapidly thickening black void. The chair disappeared under him as suddenly as the sensation of his own body. The ceiling dissolved, the walls turned into disembodied noise, and the next moment he could no longer distinguish where the nauseating cycle of consciousness ends and the fall into a bottomless shaft lined with the fragments of all his past attempts begins. The sounds of the game, voices from the chat, the barely audible hum of the city outside the window, and the clicking of the mouse merged into a single drawn-out hum, which seemed to be trying to form words, but each time broke in half, like a poorly sharpened blade against too hard armor. The protagonist thought it was another visual effect from the opening scene, just more aggressive and unusually bright. But when the sensation of breathing, the heaviness of the eyelids, and even one's own weight disappeared along with the picture, consciousness finally understood. This time the system went far beyond the usual scripts. The darkness suddenly gave way to a sticky grayness without a horizon, sky, or floor. Only thin cracks of pinkish light were visible from afar, as if someone were breaking the black shell of the world from within with one inevitable blow. In this gray depth, the first sound of the new space resounded, dull, trembling, like heavy breathing pressed against an iron grate. Then followed a short, impatient call, in which one could hear not concern, but the irritation of a man tired of waiting for a reaction from a half-dead body. Consciousness emerged from the sticky void with a jerk, as if it had been pushed out from the depths. Instead of the soft light of the monitor, a low stone arch, stained with damp mold, opened before my eyes, above which rare torches were smoking, barely driving away the thick darkness from the far corners of the dungeon. A burning dryness constricted my throat. My body responded with a dull pain in every joint, and I could feel a rough, damp stone slab under my shoulder blades, against which he found himself leaning like a forgotten rag after cleaning a very dirty place. The air was thick with a mixture of stale water, old blood, and human sweat that had soaked into the walls over the years. The smell was so thick and heavy that it couldn't be attributed to good sound design. It ate into the lungs and skin, leaving no doubt that this was not just a picture. In front of him, at arm's length, sat several figures, gray silhouettes, hunched and emaciated, with empty eyes that slid indifferently along the stone walls, iron bars and against each other, as if everything that was happening had long since ceased to matter. From the right side, someone touched his shoulder again with a rough, calloused palm. The protagonist forced his eyelids to rise and turned his head towards the source of the voice. He met the gaze of a broad-built man, whom dirt and hunger did not make resemble the other broken slaves. The man's face was crisscrossed with rough wrinkles and faded scars, and in his dark eyes there still glowed a stubborn fire, not typical of those who had long been ground to dust by prison routine. His slightly mocking, yet wary gaze revealed a disbelief that the guy by the wall was still able to hold on to this world. The protagonist tried to say something, but only a hoarse breath came out of his parched throat. His voice sounded as if he hadn't just been silent for days, and gradually dissolved into silence, where screams and pleas had long ceased to be of any use. The man with strong shoulders gave him a brief glance in which relief flashed, and dryly ordered him to stop pretending to be dead, because the time for lying around was over, and torches had already been lit up above for another battle. The words about the fight echoed loudly in my head. Along with them, an avalanche of memories painfully burst into consciousness. Not his life behind the monitor, but hundreds of passages through the same screens, chambers and bloody arenas that previously existed only in 2 dimensions. The protagonist blinked sharply, feeling the familiar names of the locations. Boss names and dry system messages emerged one after another, lining up a clear, brutal map of the world. The place he was in was listed as a training ground for those unlikely to live to see the real game. The consciousness chamber rose a little higher, showing the damp underground room in its entirety. Rows of skinny bodies huddled along the walls, thick iron bars blocking the only exit, a heavy door with dried stains on the outside, almost the same color as rust. A dull, growing rumble rolled from above, like the surf breaking through layers of stone. After a few hits of this living noise, it became clear that it was not the sea, but voices. The polyphonic, maddened roar of the crowd gathered somewhere above this cramped pit. The man next to him nodded briefly toward the ceiling, as if he was used to counting such sounds, and calmly explained that another fight was scheduled for today. Those who are still able to stand on their feet will have to rise to the top. Where on ordinary days the slaves looked only from below through narrow slits in the bars. Every word confirmed the obvious. This underground sack of stale air was not just a prison, but a storehouse of living meat, intended for someone's entertainment. The entire setting matched the location that the game's hero remembered as the lower-level training arena. He slowly, with effort, as if pulling himself out of a viscous quagmire, he raised his hand and, clinging with his fingers to the rough stone of the wall, forced his body to sit up straighter. The weakened muscles trembled under the skin as if they had to work for 3 people at once. A transparent, oily film flashed before my eyes, sliding through the air. Focusing his gaze, he saw the familiar interface rectangle hovering over the dusty stones of the floor, as if the game windows had been pulled out and hung in the air. In the center of the window, a record of the current level was pulsating, frozen at the lowest division. Next to it, in a separate column, the indicators stretched upward in dismal units, from strength to perception. Each of them resembled a silly experiment that, just a few minutes ago, seemed like just numbers on a monitor. At the very bottom of the list, separated by a thin line from the rest of the filth, a line with the name of a new skill glowed brightly, which looked as if it did not belong to this world either in scale or in meaning. Next to him, a short signature about an incredible rank shone with cold, unkind stars. He moved his gaze slightly higher to the tiny mana scale, which, like in the character editor, was frozen at a paltry value. Inside, he felt that all chances for survival in this place were lost. Even with a mythical advantage, they add up to an absurd, almost mocking joke of someone distant and indifferent. The man who had been watching over him all this time had already risen from the floor and was walking around the other prisoners, pushing aside those who pretended to still be asleep. He gave each one a short, sharp reminder that today they have only one chance to emerge from this pit not as a corpse, but as something a little more alive. Those who heard his words reacted differently. Some closed their eyes and pressed themselves tighter against the stone, trying to delay the inevitable for a few extra breaths. Someone rose sluggishly, leaning on trembling knees and clutching at the wall, as if it could change their fate. One even swore under his breath, but also stood up. Thick footsteps outside the door announced the approach of the guards before the key clanged in the lock. During this short pause, the prison room seemed to hold its breath, filling with a viscous, sticky anticipation of a blow, which will now fall upon everyone at once and drive them to the center of this dark world. The iron hinges creaked, as if tired of hearing their own groans, and the door swung inward, letting in the bright, eye-searing light of the torches. The gray walls looked bloody for a moment, and then the rough shadow of a man accustomed to speaking only with shouts and a whip burst into the opening. The head slave instinctively looked down, so as not to meet the eyes of those who would now drive them off. At that moment, a translucent window flashed in the corner of his vision again, displaying a brief status of the skill and a dim note indicating its inactive state, as if to remind us that even myths demand a price for every breath. The whip slashed the air right in front of the lead slave's face, cutting through the heavy stench of the dungeon with a sharp whistle. The tip of the skin, soaked in old blood, passed along the stone so closely that small fragments of dust splashed onto the cheek, leaving burning pinpoint pricks. The guards' rough voices, devoid of any human interest, gave several short orders to the slaves, which boiled down to one thing: rise, form up, and move quickly enough to avoid wasting the precious time of those at the top paying for the spectacle. Someone near the main slave did not manage to get up from the floor quickly enough, and a new blow of the whip struck the man in the back with a damp, wet sound. After the blow, a thin cry escaped, which immediately choked, as if this man had long ago forgotten how to scream loudly. The chief slave, clinging with his fingers to the edge of his own rags, rose to his feet, feeling how the world around him was slightly floating, and his legs seemed alien, too light and weak, as if he had been given back not his own body, but a cheap copy, hastily cobbled together from what was left. An accompanying slave stood next to him, the same broad-shouldered man who was the first to pull the protagonist out of his semi-conscious state. Now, without being distracted by conversations, he simply moved towards the exit, becoming a human shield between the chief slave and the hot-tempered guards. The lead slave glanced at the hands of the accompanying slave, at the lumpy muscles under the dirty skin, and at the old scars on his fingers, which could have belonged either to a former warrior or to someone else, who too often took up arms not of their own free will, but because it was the only way to survive. They moved towards the doorway in a narrow, close group, and each step echoed in their knees with a dull pain, reminding that the current endurance of the chief slave is barely suitable for that. To reach the stairs, let alone fight in a place where even healthy people are torn to pieces for applause. Beyond the threshold of the chamber, a narrow corridor with a low ceiling opened up, along which the smoke from the torches lazily drifted, forming a yellowish cloud hanging over their heads. Every breath here felt like a mixture of coal and dust, as if the walls themselves were slowly burning away the old human pain within them. Guards armed with short clubs and long whips hurriedly urged the slaves forward from both front and back. Each of their steps echoed heavily on the stone, as if it were not people walking along the corridor, and the system of this place itself moved the gears of its mechanism forward. A narrow flight of steps led upward, where the steps were worn down to a semicircular smoothness, traces of hundreds and thousands of souls that had previously climbed along the same trajectory. This trodden path seemed not like a staircase, but a ritual slope along which the living were driven to the mouth of the arena. Each new step tore the chief slave away from the viscous smell of the damp dungeon and brought him closer to a different air, still soaked in blood and sweat, but mixed with hot. The dense breathing of the crowd, which could already be felt now, long before going out into the open air. A map of the location, which he knew by heart as a player, briefly flashed in the head of the main slave. Below are the slave chambers. Above is a round arena, surrounded by 3 tiers of spectator seats and rooms for those who is holding this whole bloody spectacle on a leash. And somewhere above, behind the stone vaults, is the city that benefits from all of this. However, this knowledge did not bring any comfort, because instead of a comfortable view from above, there was only the sensation of one's own breathing, confused by the 24 steps, and the heartbeat pounding in his temples so loudly that it almost drowned out the roar of the crowd that broke through the upper hatch. At the top, right at the exit, the guards stopped the slaves with a short, sharp gesture, forcing them to form a crooked line. Several guards walked down the row, lazily assessing each body, as if checking the goods before exposing them to a more powerful predator. Light was already shining through the open doorway, not pure daylight, but fried through the flickering heat of fires and magical torches, illuminating the arena so that every splash of blood was clearly visible from the farthest rows. This light made not only the eyes, but also the mind squint. The chief slave heard laughter rolling above, the clink of glasses mingling with the roar of the crowd, and he understood that for those sitting there, the people below are no different from pigs in a slaughterhouse, except that their cries are more pleasant to the ear and hold attention longer. The guard at the exit waved his hand briefly, and the iron grate, which had previously been held in place by a massive mechanism, began to rise with a drawn-out roar, as if the mouth of a giant beast was opening, about to swallow another portion of living flesh for its own pleasure. A blinding light flashed across the chief slave's eyes, causing them to close their eyes for a second. As he took his first step out, he felt the dry, hot air of the arena hit his face, burning away the remnants of the damp underground cold and replacing one suffocating smell with another, much more furious and loud. In front of the chief slave, stretching to the very edge of the visible world, a round amphitheater opened up, studded with rows of stone seats, packed to capacity with people in skins, cloaks, and expensive clothes. Each of them looked down with interest to where their short and cruel fun began. The bottom of the arena was a compacted earthen area, dug up in places down to the stone, and a fight had clearly recently taken place on this loose crust of dirt. The sky and the blazing fire of torches were reflected in pools of caked blood, and here and there were still uncollected remains lying around, turned into nameless trash. On the opposite side of the ring, heavy gates were visible, decorated with metal spikes and trophies embedded in the wood. Even from here, one could detect a slight trembling of the doors, behind which a new wave of violence was hiding, ready to burst out at the first signal. To the left, slightly above the level of the arena, there was a platform with carved railings, on which the arena herald was already standing, dressed in a flashy outfit and using a magical voice amplifier. This man with one shining eye and one eye covered by a bandage announced to the public in a familiar tone that the current fight promised to be especially interesting. The lead slave and the other slaves participating in the fight moved sluggishly towards the center of the arena, feeling the thousands of gazes of the arena spectators on them, who assessed them not as individuals, but as sets of chances, bloody scenarios, and possible bets. There wasn't even a hint of sympathy in this sticky mixture of alien curiosity. Around them lay piles of old weapons, rusty swords, broken spears, shields with chipped edges, axes with cracked handles. Everything that had long been written off from service in real wars and was now used in games for those whose lives had also been counted. Some slaves immediately rushed to the piles of iron, grabbing the first thing they could reach, and they pressed these heavy, uncomfortable objects to their chests as if they were their last hope. However, in their unattached fingers, the blades felt more like unnecessary weight than a tool for salvation. The chief slave paused for a moment, allowing these scenes to unfold, and only then slowly stepped towards the pile of weapons. He no longer looked with the eyes of a player choosing the optimal characteristics, but with the gaze of a man who understood perfectly well that any blade here, just a weak excuse to delay the end. The chief slave's fingers closed around the hilt of an old one-handed sword, covered in small spots of rust. The metal in his hand felt so heavy that the muscles in his forearm immediately began to ache in protest, causing his shoulder to twitch slightly. And grip the handle more tightly with your fingers so as not to drop the weapon at the first moment. Next to him, the accompanying slave picked up a spear from the ground, checked the balance of the shaft, and twirled it slightly in his hand. From the way the muscles flexed confidently under his skin, it was clear that this position had never been new to him. Rather, on the contrary, too familiar and therefore sadly natural. From above, from the arena herald's platform, a magically amplified voice was heard again, loudly announcing to the audience that a group of debtors had gathered in the arena, having lost everything they had and even more. These people are fighting not only for debt forgiveness, but also for a symbolic chance to escape this rotten world. The mention of freedom, a generous reward, and debt forgiveness swept across the arena like sweet bait. A weak, desperate spark of hope flared up in the eyes of several slaves around the protagonist, as if someone had thrown it into their stuffy. A dead-end corner, a tiny piece of light, even if that light belonged to the executioner's porcelain lamp. The chief slave only gripped the hilt of his sword tighter because he remembered all too well from dozens of previous attempts how this particular scenario ended. The numbers at the top of the screen reset to 0, the camera tilts to the side, and the character's body is sent into a pit where the real game begins. Bright fiery symbols flared above the opposite gates, signaling the start of the second phase of the spectacle. The heavy doors with steel teeth slowly rose, revealing a dark corridor, from the depths of which came the low grinding sound of heavy armor, chains, and the breathing of a huge beast. From the darkness, the first thing that appeared was a bright glint on the massive blade of an axe, then a shoulder covered by a thick metal plate, and finally a figure emerged fully, whose presence caused the air in the arena to tremble and the shouts of the crowd to rise to an almost hysterical level. The gladiator was a colossus of flesh and iron, the height of two human figures stacked on top of each other, with arms as thick as, like alien torsos, and a helmet that completely hid the face, but left open two dark slits in which a predatory, dispassionate fire smoldered dimly. Streaks of old dried blood, which had not been washed off for a long time, ran down his armor. Each step the gladiator took left deep dents in the loose earth, as if it was not flesh that was moving beneath the armor, but a heavier, denser entity. A painfully familiar splash of the system window flashed above his head. The translucent number shifted towards an indecently high value. If this were a normal race, Gladiator would have paused for a second to assess the chance. But now it was clear that the gap between them was not measured only by numbers. The crowd erupted in a roar of fury as the herald bellowed out the gladiator's nickname, cutting the air with a theatrical pause. This name, familiar from many playthroughs, hieroglyphs now sounded like the name of a living, full-fledged legend capable of tearing people apart in the literal sense. The slaves around began to shrink into an uneven, trembling ring. Some took a few steps back, instinctively trying to hide in the crowd. But the circle of the arena and the gaze of the guards above left no chance to hide either in the shadows or among one's own. The broad-shouldered slave with the spear took a deep breath, raised his weapon into a fighting stance, and briefly called on the others to stay together. Don't scatter one by one, and use your numerical advantage while the enemy hasn't yet reached full strength. There was an understanding in his voice that these words were more for self-deception. He'd heard phrases like these before, free players uttering them in voice chat before a raid on a formidable boss. He knew that collective courage rarely survives the first blows when metal truly meets flesh. The gladiator in the center of the arena paused for a moment, lazily twirling one of his axes in his hand as if it weighed nothing. His gaze from under his helmet slid over the slender, emaciated silhouettes of the slaves, assessing them not as a threat, but as another batch of meat intended to warm up the crowd. Somewhere high up, beyond the slaves' visibility, in one of the closed boxes, someone sitting in the shadows leaned forward slightly, watching the fight with interest but not interfering yet, like an animal choosing the most unusual trajectories for hunting. He turned his gaze back to the translucent interface hanging in his field of vision like a splinter in his eye. The level and status indicators remained unchanged, and the units in the strength and endurance columns looked like a mockery of the very idea of battle. And the line with the unique skill exuded an icy, unkind glow. Next to the skill name, the energy consumption per second mark still loomed, and the barely noticeable mana bar in the corner didn't seem like a scale, but a thin, treacherously trembling thread that promised to break before the gladiator had time to truly inhale the air of this final dash. Having finished his lazy warm-up, Gladiator stepped forward. The first blow of his axe to the ground, done more for intimidation than for any real purpose, sent up a fountain of dry dust and clods of dirt. The weakest of the slaves reflexively retreated, breaking the already shaky formation. The crowd buzzed, anticipating the imminent break. In this hot, viscous hum, a familiar rhythm could be heard, the same one that had previously accompanied every unsuccessful attempt. Now it was not the sound of headphones, but the living roar of tens of thousands of throats, demanding not a result, but a spectacle. The first to break down was an emaciated man with a faded scarf on his head. He gritted his teeth and rushed forward with his rusty sword in front, as if he believed that his swiftness was capable of compensating for the gap between his body and the mass of steel opposite him. His steps on the loose earth were loud and heavy, every movement betraying fear rather than training. The gladiator didn't even change his stance, only slightly turning his body when the slave's blade pathetically slid along the edge of his chest armor, leaving a barely noticeable scratch. The counterattack came with lazy, almost indifferent precision. One of the axes described a short arc, and the sound of metal colliding with bones sounded dull and rich, as if someone had split an old, dry log table. The first attacker's body fell to the ground, split deep enough that the life was gone before the dust had even settled. There was no scream or struggle in that fall, only a convulsive twitching of the limbs, slowly dying down to the delighted roar of the crowd. This first, demonstratively light blow tore apart the thin remnants of restraint in the others. Someone rushed forward with a wild cry, trying to take advantage of the moment while Gladiator was supposedly open. Someone pulled back, and the formation around the enemy broke up into clumsy, unconnected throws. The Gladiator watched this with the painful clarity of a man who had seen this scenario dozens of times before, regretting that others did not possess the knowledge that had become a curse for him. Here in the arena, nothing they do will change the predetermined outcome. The broad-shouldered slave with the spear clenched his teeth so hard that his cheekbones jutted out, took a step forward and shouted a call for a joint strike. He himself rushed towards the giant, trying to approach at an angle from which he could scratch an unprotected area. His spear, although old, moved in his hands much more confidently than the swords of the others. The brief moment when the tip passed near the joint of the armor on the gladiator's side showed that a slightly more precise trajectory might have left at least some real damage, even if not fatal. But the gladiator, as if anticipating the maneuver, changed his support, transferred his weight to the other leg, and with the second axe made a horizontal cut so fast that the eye did not have time to follow the path of the blade, but only saw a flash of blood and the jerk of the body, torn into uneven pieces. The spear flew out of the hands of the broad-shouldered slave and, spinning in the air, stuck into the ground. He himself collapsed next to the already cooling first corpse. The two bodies, which had recently been trying to become a support for the others, now only created additional obstacles for those who continued to rush about in panic. He, standing a little behind, felt a wave of a sickening mixture of rage, fear, and cold understanding rising inside him. This strange, painful combination coalesced into one clear conclusion. He could not accept the usual path, to die with everyone else. His weakened body trembled under the thin cloth of his clothes, and every breath reminded him that here, in the world, where any numbers have a direct physical embodiment. He is objectively the weakest of all those destined to shed blood on the court today. At the same time, deep beneath his sternum, an alien, unnatural calm pulsed, a calm that was not common to ordinary people in this world. This confidence, like a cold hand, kept the mind from completely collapsing into panic, allowing it to look at what was happening as a task, not a sentence. The gladiator moved on, stepping easily, almost playfully, over the bodies. Each new blow left behind a new doll-like body, heavily collapsing to the ground, from which everything had been eradicated except for a short final twitch of muscles. The crowd above was choking with delight, forgetting even the names of those on whom they had recently placed bets, but shouting the nickname of the main killer with redoubled force, as if this cry alone could extend his undisputed dominance over the court for another fight. The slaves' legs were giving way, and some were already trying to retreat to the edge of the arena, where the iron walls rose high. The guards on the perimeter lazily aimed their crossbows and spears at them, making it clear without words that there was no way back for the slaves. Against this background, the immobility of the protagonist looked almost unnatural. The protagonist stood with his shoulders slightly hunched, gripping the hilt of his rusty sword so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His emaciated body seemed ready to collapse under the weight of not only the weapon, but also the invisible burden of all the choices he had made so far. When the translucent window with parameters appeared in the field of view again, the protagonist's gaze involuntarily focused on a single line where the symbols of a mythical skill flickered within a narrow frame. Next to it, contrary to the usual dull status, a tiny inscription appeared about the potential readiness of the ability. A strange, subtle sensation arose deep in his chest and in the fingers gripping the sword. It was as if an invisible thread had stretched between the main character and the blade, a thread that had not existed before. This fragile channel allowed his will to reach something much more ancient and powerful. The protagonist took a small, almost imperceptible step forward, moving away from those few slaves that were still alive and tried to huddle closer to each other. The entire arena with its shouts and stomping was momentarily pushed into the background, leaving only a narrow strip of loose earth between the main character and the gladiator. The gladiator, who had been busy throwing his axe at another unfortunate man, froze half a step, as if he had noticed a change in the rhythm of the movement on the platform. The gladiator slowly turned his helmet towards the protagonist, allowing a heavy gaze from the dark slits to fall on his skinny body, abnormal even for a slave. There was neither fear nor any particular interest in that look, just a light, dry assessment, as mechanical as the movement of gears in an old mechanism. The protagonist clearly understood that in the eyes of this man, made of steel and lethal experience, he is not yet even listed as a target worthy of a first strike. Somewhere deep inside, not in the player's mind, but in the new flesh, stubbornness echoed. Even if death is inevitable here, at least it should not be just another faceless frame in a long line of identical massacres, but something that will leave a noticeable mark on this stone. The protagonist's fingers on the hilt of the sword clenched painfully, and he took a deep breath, allowing a cold, inhumanly even calm to spread through his muscles, sweeping away the last remnants of trembling. His gaze fell again on the line with a mythical skill, where a small but clear symbol finally changed state. The main character clearly saw a short caption stating that the ability was available for use, and next to it, an unchanging, inescapable formula for the price for every second of its activation, as well as a pitiful unit in the mana scale, which, according to the laws of this world, could not withstand even a breath, let alone a full blow. The world around shrank into a thin tunnel. The noise of the crowd turned into a distant roar, the smell of blood into a barely perceptible aftertaste, and the heavy figure of the gladiator in the center of the arena became the only point on which the main character's focus remained, as if the rest of the world had ceased to exist. The protagonist raised his sword, trying not to think about how awkward and heavy this movement looked on such a fragile body. The blade, covered in rust spots, trembled slightly in the air, reflecting the dim glow of the torches, as if laughing at the contrast between its appearance and the cold fury of the one holding it in his hands. At the same time, the protagonist deliberately reached out to the deep source of power contained in the strange combination of numbers and the skill title, and almost physically felt how the hidden lock clicked, giving access to a state that was not for people like him. The main character awakened in this body again. The translucent window flickered, and a weak line of mana twitched, freezing on the thin line between presence and emptiness. Next to the skill's name, a short, eye-catching mark flashed indicating that the effect had been activated, although according to the laws of this world, it should not have lasted longer than a moment. At the moment of the breakthrough of power, time around cracked like thin ice under the heel. The whole scene, filled with shouts and movements, suddenly broke into a strange, glassy silence, where every speck of dust in the air hung separately, not daring to change its position. The protagonist felt the heaviness of the sword disappear, as if the blade had transformed from rough iron into an extension of his hand, light and precise. The world around, which just a moment ago seemed seemed too loud and heavy, now opened up neatly. A clear map of lines, angles, and weak spots in someone else's armor. The protagonist's body, which had previously barely been able to stand on its feet, was filled with pure, transparent strength that did not require muscles or endurance. Every movement became obvious and the only possible one. There was no doubt, no options, only one perfect path for the blade to travel through the space between him and the enemy's neck. Everything that previously seemed like an impassable wall of skills and levels and numbers crumbled to dust under the realization that during this hundredth of a second the main character was in a completely different dimension, where the concepts of too slow or too weak did not exist. The gladiator's eyes in the depths of his dark helmet had not yet fully turned towards the protagonist. His heavy body was just beginning to turn, anticipating another sweeping blow, and the protagonist was already stepping forward, leaving behind his former, weak self, like old skin, useless for a new predator. The sword cut through the air without a single unnecessary hesitation, obeying not the hands, but pure thought. The trajectory of his movement was so precise and coldly calculated that it seemed as if the world itself had buckled, to expose the place where the metal of the armor slightly separates from the flesh under the blade. The sound of the blow was unlike any that had been heard in the arena before, neither dull, nor rich, nor ringing. Rather, it was a strangely quiet but distinct click that accompanied the perfect separation of two surfaces, as if a knife were drawn along a taut string, dissolving it into thin air. The main character didn't even have time to realize the step he had taken. The next moment after this flawless, impossible movement, the world around suddenly collapsed back into normal density. The protagonist's ears were suddenly struck by a deafening, ragged noise from the crowd, as if someone had turned the sound back on after a long pause. The mana bar in the corner of his vision dropped to zero. The mythical skill faded, leaving behind the feeling of an empty, charred shell. The weight of the sword immediately returned with all its former, unbearable heaviness, causing the protagonist's fingers to tremble in protest and his lungs to gasp for air. In front of the main character, just one step away, stood the massive body of a gladiator. But the next second the head, previously hidden under a heavy helmet, swung strangely awkwardly to the side. With this movement, the entire upper segment of the neck separated from the rest, as if someone had carefully cut the invisible thread holding it. The severed body part, still encased in steel, slid through the air and turned over, fell to the ground slightly to the side, leaving a wide, arcing streak of dark blood in the air. The blood scattered in small drops and was absorbed into the ground as naturally as water that had been waiting for its moment for a long time. The bulk of the body remained standing for several absurdly long moments, swaying like a huge, off-balance statue. Then, out of control, it slowly fell forward, crashing to the ground with such a dull, multi-layered roar that even the spectators in the upper rows involuntarily fell silent. The gladiator's head, knocked loose from his helmet at the moment of impact, rolled across the loose ground, leaving behind a thin trail of blood. Each new short blow on the unevenness of the arena echoed in the stunned silence, until the head crashed into the stone barrier with a dull, disgusting final thud. At that moment, the entire amphitheater, which had been roaring until then, seemed to have suddenly lost its voice. The shouts, laughter, swearing, and betting were drowned out by a heavy silence, unusual for such a place, as if the very air had been knocked out by a blow that no one expected, neither those sitting below nor those watching from above. The protagonist stood, breathing heavily, with his sword lowered. The blood that had managed to splash onto his face and clothes slowly flowed down, tickling his skin, but these sensations seemed distant, almost non-existent. The protagonist's entire consciousness was focused on that tiny flash of power he had just experienced, which left a dizzying emptiness inside. A faint, almost physical aftertaste of that feeling when the world became momentarily controllable and transparent still lingered in the protagonist's fingers and shoulders. In this searingly vivid memory of movement, there was hidden an unpleasant truth. Even if the protagonist can repeat this again, every such effort will cost him his entire existence. On the opposite side of the arena, figures began to appear in the boxes behind carved bars and translucent curtains. Some expressed rage, others confusion, and still others an outright predatory interest, as if they had finally found truly rare prey in front of them. In one of the closed lodges at the very top, hidden from plain sight, the man in the mask with the beak of a bird of prey slowly rose from his seat, leaning on the carved armrest. He peered closely through the slits in his mask at the small, emaciated figure in the center of the arena, next to which a pool of blood was spreading. The arena owner's escorts, the lookouts and bodyguards, exchanged quick, tense glances. They were clearly not accustomed to the fact that a predictably organized spectacle would break the script so abruptly. Their faces showed not only surprise, but also poorly concealed anxiety. The man in the dark cloak, who stepped out of the shadows just behind the masked figure, usually remained unnoticed even by those who knew of his existence. He kept his eyes on the stage and admitted that he did not notice the moment of impact, although his eyes were trained to detect movements much faster. disaster. This confession, spoken in a quiet but confident voice, finally fixed the new state of affairs in the mind of the arena owner. What lay on the sand was not just a dead gladiator who had long been part of the program, but a ruined pillar of reputation. There was someone standing nearby whose value instantly surpassed the price of any lost spectacle. Below, among the simple slaves, the silence gradually cracked, giving way first to individual uncertain and surprised cries, then a chaotic hum in which the whispers of amazement and the laughter of those were mixed. Those who continued to perceive what was happening as entertainment, and the growing delight of those who truly understood the scale of what had happened. Guards at the edge of the arena, who until recently were ready to shoot arrows at anyone. Those who would have tried to escape now froze, not taking their eyes off the lone figure with a sword. They waited for new orders, not daring to act according to their usual patterns in a situation that did not fit into any of their scenarios. The exhausted slave standing in the center of the arena felt the adrenaline that kept him on his feet begin to fade, leaving behind a sticky weakness. The sword in his hand was once again turning into a rough, incompatible piece of metal, demanding from his muscles something they did not have. Under the lingering weakness, a new, heavy understanding was born. Now he is not just a slave, driven into the arena for one fight, and not just a lost player in a world where numbers can tear flesh. From that moment on, he was looked upon by those who were accustomed to making people like him into instruments for their much larger games. The roar of the crowd grew louder, turning into a cry that mixed fear, delight, greed, and a thirst for new miracles. Above this noise, the herald's voice cut through the general cacophony, trying to put the incident into verbal form suitable for sale to the public. The herald hastily chose his words, turning the unexpected, almost impossible result into a story about an unexpected hero from among the slaves, about a miraculous turn of fate, and how even in places like this arena, a shining, bloody meteor sometimes flares up. The words sounded loud and beautiful, but the exhausted slave felt the earth trembling under his feet, not as an effect of a pompous announcement, but as a slight but clear change in the direction of one's entire life. From prepared scenarios to those where even the memory of hundreds of games doesn't tell you what will happen next. As the first fragmentary cries of the crowd began to coalesce into a coherent noise, belated guards burst into the arena, forming a wide, nervous semicircle around the slave. Their spears, pointed downwards, trembled not from fatigue, but from poorly concealed fear, which this scene inspired even in those who were accustomed to looking at death every day. One of the guards, apparently the senior one, overcoming his confusion, ordered them to lower their weapons and not make any sudden movements. There was an unusual hoarseness in his voice, as if even words honed by years of command were now struggling to find their way through his parched throat. The slave obediently unclenched his fingers and allowed the sword to fall to the ground with a dull sound, where it barely penetrated the blood-soaked loose soil. However, the feeling of threat did not diminish. On the contrary, it became even clearer that what they were afraid of here was not the iron in his hands, but what had passed through that iron for a moment. The herald, still standing on his elevated platform, finally found the right tone, announcing the unprecedented victory of a slave over the champion of the arena. He feverishly wove into his speech words about fate, miracles, and the mercy of patrons, but every sentence sounded as if he was trying to persuade himself more than the audience. The crowd, having recovered from the initial stupor, began to gradually come into motion. Some threw down the remains of food and cups in a rage, cursing the lost bets, while others were choking with delight, anticipating new games around the unexpectedly born legend. The slave felt his legs finally become weak, and only the inertia of the recent jerk kept his body upright. The world around him tilted slightly, like the deck of a ship caught between two waves, and each new breath seemed too heavy for lungs stretched to the limit. The guards reached out to him, intending to twist his arms and push him face down into the ground to show the crowd that they were still in control of the situation. But one of them suddenly froze, putting his hand to his ear, where a tiny communication crystal glinted under the skin. His face turned suddenly pale. The whispered order remained unknown to the others, but the consequences became apparent immediately. The spears dropped slightly, the aggression in the movements subsided, and a loose circle of sharp tips formed around the slave. But rather a corridor through which he was to be politely, but without the right to refuse, led to the one who gave the order. In the depths of the arena, one of the heavy side passages leading to the inner rooms swung open. A figure in the formal attire of a guild servant emerged from the cool shadows, looking up at everything as usual, not because of status, but because there is a staircase leading from the arena here. The guild servant's gaze lingered on the gladiator's dead body, then turned it to the emaciated figure of the slave. In his calm, practiced to the point of automatism, not surprise flashed, but a dry fixation of fact. A valuable, non-standard resource has emerged that must be immediately locked up and branded with the owner's mark. He gestured for the guards to step back and invited the slave to follow him. The tone in which it was done left little room for ambiguity. Formally, it was proposed to rise from the mud, but in reality, it was to hang a new, more expensive chain made of a different metal around the neck. The slave moved slowly after the servant towards the dark passage. Every step on the ground, mixed with blood, echoed in the muscles with aching pain. The noise of the arena behind him gradually faded, turning from the living roar of a human mass into a distant, vague hum, a reminder of what he just did. The passage greeted us with coolness and semi-darkness. A narrow corridor, illuminated by rare magical lamps, stretched upward and to the side. Along the walls there were closed doors with reinforced locks, behind which, according to the slave's memory, hidden were gladiators' rooms, weapons warehouses, and quarters for those who considered themselves the masters of this underground kingdom. The steps of the servant in front of him were light and precise, but his own were heavy and uncertain. Even if the slave tried to turn around and run back, the body would not obey, and the guards behind were just waiting for such an attempt, keeping their fingers on the handles of their weapons. Out of the corner of his eye he saw details familiar from the game. Relief patterns on the walls, hidden ventilation slots through which special smoke effects were thrown into the arena, and almost invisible edges behind which traps or safety mechanisms could be hidden. However, this knowledge was almost useless because the scenario, which had never been in the game, was already developing along other lines. In previous playthroughs, his body would now be lying in a pit among the other dead, waiting for the necromancer's intervention rather than walking independently down the corridor leading to the upper floors of the guild. The staircase they used to climb to the next level turned out to be unexpectedly meticulously maintained. The stone was polished smooth, the air was cleaner, and the smell of blood and sweat had receded, giving way to a light aroma of incense and expensive wine, seeping from the distant halls where trades and closed deals were taking place. On the landing, they were met by a massive door made of dark wood with metal inserts in the form of stylized wings. The attendant stopped in front of her and carefully examined the protagonist, as if making sure that it was this man who had caused the disruption of the arena's usual order. He knocked briefly with a special rhythm that caused a quiet movement behind the door. Then he turned his head to the protagonist and warned him to behave decently, since mistakes beyond the threshold were more expensive than on the sand of the arena. There was a clicking sound inside. The internal locks jingled, and the door slowly slid open, revealing a small room finished in expensive fabric and wood. The soft, warm light from the lamps cast thick golden spots on the floor, which contrasted sharply with the dirty dust that still clung to the protagonist's bare feet. In the depths of the room, by the wide window overlooking the arena from the height of the third tier, sat a figure in a mask with a carved beak. Against the backdrop of the rich surroundings, this figure looked like the true master of the place, accustomed to looking down on any human movement. A few servants and guards stood at a distance, dissolving into the shadows, but their presence was keenly felt, like pointed blades, ready to slip out of their sheaths at the slightest mistake by the guest. The servant who brought the main character here bowed respectfully and stepped aside, leaving him alone in the middle of the soft carpet, which seemed to spring incongruously under his dirty, exhausted feet. At this moment, the difference between the main character and those who lived in similar rooms was felt especially painfully. The masked figure slowly turned towards the protagonist, and an attentive light flashed in the eye slits, a searching radiance, unlike the gaze of a person who sees a personality in the interlocutor. It was the look of a merchant accustomed to weighing and evaluating goods before deciding how to use them. The arena owner noted that today the arena seemed to have a new hero, and with him, a new problem and a new opportunity. These words made the air in the room feel even heavier, reminding us that in this world, any miracle is immediately attributed to someone else. The protagonist felt that gaze, boring into him through the slits of his mask, and for a moment he felt like he was not a human being who had accidentally survived an impossible battle, but a strange jewel, which is assessed by its weight and strength, estimating how much blood and gold can be squeezed out of each of his next steps. However, deep beneath the skin, beneath the fatigue and the burning sensation of fresh blood, another feeling was flaring up. Not only fear of the master of the arena, but also a quiet, stubborn premonition that this time he entered the room not as a speechless commodity, but as a thorn, which may one day get stuck in the throat of those who are used to swallowing entire worlds. The silence in the room lasted a little longer than was required for social formality, and every beat of the protagonist's heart under the mask's watchful gaze felt like a test of strength. Outside the window, in the depths of the arena, the flames of the torches still blazed, illuminating the bloody stains on the sand. But here, above the echoing mouth of the amphitheater, a silence, shielded from noise, reigned, created by expensive carpets, thick walls, and the owner's habit of turning off the sound where it interfered with bargaining. The arena's master slowly leaned back in his chair, and with this movement the fabric on his shoulders rustled, and the feathers on the edges of the mask trembled slightly, like a bird deciding to settle more comfortably on its perch before pecking. He did not speak first, knowing full well that in such places the one who always takes the initiative in the conversation is the one who sits higher, and any careless words of a slave can turn victory victory into a reason for punishment. The arena owner was the first to break the silence, noting that he had never seen a debtor in his memory. Thrown onto the sand as a bargaining chip, it failed to so neatly destroy the main symbol of power of this place. His words sounded both like praise and an accusation of damage. The owner's intonation betrayed a mixture of irritation and admiration, similar to the reaction of a collector if someone accidentally breaks an expensive exhibit. But at the same time, it shows something equally valuable, that the old loss becomes an investment in a new deal. Parchments rustled quietly on the side. One of the guild's scribes hastily wrote down the details of what had happened, double-checking the betting figures, losses, and potential dividends that can now be extracted from a rare event in the arena. The owner continued, as if speaking his thoughts out loud, noting that such people do not appear out of nowhere, especially in the status of a slave, and that the protagonist's path to the arena was quite winding, to interest not only creditors, but also those accustomed to working with non-standard assets. He noticed the masked figure tilt his head slightly to the side and realized that the protagonist is expected to respond, even if only to test the clarity of his mind after an impossible dash on the sand. The protagonist exhaled slowly and, without attempting to justify himself or show off, dryly stated the simple truth. Failed deals, mounting debts, a senseless attempt to buy someone else's life at the cost of your own, and ultimately, the guild rope around his neck tightened to the limit only today. He didn't mention that he already had a detailed map of this world in his head, and did not make it clear that the arena and the city were familiar to him even before he arrived here. There was no point in admitting these details to a man who measures people not by their memories, but by their possible length of service. The arena owner listened to the story without visible emotion, only occasionally tapping his fingers on the armrest of his chair. When the protagonist finished, a short pause filled the room, filled with the quiet rustling of the bodyguard's clothes as he moved closer to the shadow by the wall. Then a quiet laugh sounded behind the mask, short, devoid of joy, more like the dry cough of a man who has played with human destinies to the point of satiety. This laughter did not affect those around him. The servants and guards stood motionless, as if they were accustomed to fencing themselves off from such manifestations of the master. The masked voice noted that the story of the debt that brought the protagonist and dozens of others here was of little value, but that one of the faceless debtors managed to do that in a split second. Something no arena guest has ever managed to do. Changes its category from a consumable to an investment object. The word investment was in the air, and it sounded colder than any mention of mercy or gratitude, because it always comes with a string of conditions, payback periods, and hard interest rates, which in this world are paid not only in coins, but also in blood. The protagonist did not ask any questions, allowing the owner to develop the topic. He began to list slowly and measuredly, like a banker reading out the terms of a new contract. What does the guild own in this city, and what role does the arena and its champions play in maintaining power over the crowd and the underground market? The old gladiator, who fell under the blow of the protagonist, turned out to be not only a crowd favorite, but also an important element of the intimidation system. Many debtors, knowing his reputation, preferred not to bring the matter to a fight, agreeing to any enslaving conditions just to avoid ending up on the sands of the arena. Now this terrifying symbol lay dead, and the fear that had previously worked for the guild could turn into dangerous thoughts for those who are accustomed to considering power as immobile. If someone like them was able to destroy the invincible executioner with one move, then other pillars could one day be shaken. The arena owner spoke about this not with panic, but with the cold calculation of a man who is accustomed to seeing in every crack not only a threat, but also a new line of growth. Where the old idol falls, a new statue can be erected with a different name and a different chain around its neck. The arena master presented the guild's proposal in a straightforward, almost lazy tone, outlining the essence of the deal, which, in his opinion, could only be refused in the imagination. The guild writes off all of the protagonist's current debts and no longer considers him an ordinary slave, but in return it takes away all rights to his life and power, turning him into a contract gladiator and subsequently perhaps into a personal tool for more delicate tasks. The protagonist listened attentively to each point, confidently guessing the unspoken conditions. Any attempt to escape would be punishable not only by death, but also by retribution from those whose names the guild had already surely discovered in his past. Any disobedience will result in fines that will make the current debt insignificant. The terms included the word study, which is rare for such agreements. The arena's owner made it clear that he was not going to throw such a talent into the thick of battle without proper preparation, and mentioned that there were people in the guild who could turn natural talent into manageable and predictable power. At the same time, the arena owner emphasized that the mythical flash of power noticed in the arena will not go unnoticed by those above him. Rumors of such anomalies rarely remain within the confines of a single city, and sooner or later the hands of larger players will reach out to this place. He noted that the proposal was not an act of generosity, but an attempt to preempt other people's claims. If the protagonist accepts the contract contract and becomes the official property of the Ruins Guild, then anyone who wants to seize his power will first have to deal with their clan and its connections. The words about property sounded so casual, as if they were talking not about a living person, but about a rare animal caught in remote lands. The protagonist once again felt how the fine line between freedom and bondage in this world is practically indistinguishable, especially when survival is at stake. His gaze involuntarily slid to the window, beyond which the arena, flooded with torchlight, was still visible. He imagined his body lying there for a moment, next to the nameless corpses. If the sword strike had not reached its target, or if the mythical skill had worked even 1/100th of a second less. The protagonist woke up in this body after death and now faced a choice. The choice that was formally given to the protagonist was as conditional as the freedom of the slaves brought into the arena under the promise of ransom. Either he accepts the contract and prolongs his life in the iron cage of the guild, or he refuses. And then his death on the sand will become a new legend about how fate does not tolerate willfulness. The protagonist exhaled slowly, feeling how fatigue, fear, and the remnants of the game's coldness merged into a difficult decision. He realized that no matter what part of him spoke of freedom, body and mind, those who have already left one world will not endure a second senseless self-destruction for the sake of a ghostly protest. The protagonist agreed to accept the conditions if he was given the opportunity to use his power in this way, so that it doesn't rust in the arena's dungeons and isn't wasted on show executions for the sake of a bored crowd. The arena owner slightly tilted his beaked mask and expressed satisfaction with the agreement reached. There was no gratitude or joy in that tone, only the calm satisfaction of a man who had successfully closed another profitable deal. One of the servants brought a heavy metal case to the table containing several thin black plates and parchment with a contract. While the servant was unfolding the documents and preparing to read out the official wording, the protagonist was surprised to notice that he could barely hear his voice. His gaze slid back to the internal status window. The stats remained shamefully low, and the mythical skill went into hibernation again. And in the debt column, instead of the old numbers, there was a gaping empty space, which would soon be filled with new, more cunning obligations. Meanwhile, the servant placed a cold plate on the protagonist's hand and carefully made an incision in the skin, allowing a few drops of blood to soak into the dark metal carved within almost invisible runes. These runes now linked his life with the seal of the guild. The blood, having been absorbed into the veins of the runes, flared with a dim light and quickly died out, leaving a barely visible imprint on the plate. An invisible but noticeable grip tightened around my wrist, not physical, but deep, as if the world itself recognized the new chain as legitimate and connected it to its loss. The arena master nodded as he saw the seal accept the blood and declared that from that moment on, the protagonist's life officially ceased to belong to him. Any injury, victory, or defeat he sustains will become part of the guild's account, and every mythical moment spent will be recorded in the World Balance's debt ledger. He did not specify where these books were kept or who maintained them. It was enough to know that now there was nowhere to run, neither in this world nor back, because even if the mask is torn from the face of the owner of the arena, the invisible loop on your wrist will already be tightening with each step. Instead, the arena owner quietly asked for only one thing: access to training, knowledge, and information about this world that was not included in the regular player reports. The quality of this knowledge now determined not only the survival of the protagonist, but also the price, which the guild will be able to request from those who come for similar power later. The owner chuckled, calling this request reasonable, and promised that starting tomorrow the main character would be provided with a mentor, a person who can dissect talents down to their structure in order to understand how they are structured, and teach the bearer to survive not only in the arena, but also in the shadows of those places where debtors usually do not set foot. He also warned that interest in the main character has already reached a higher level. Rumors will surely spread through hidden channels about a slave who destroyed an invincible gladiator in 1/100th of a second, and some of those who hear this story will prefer not to bargain, but simply send their executioners and spellcasters here. Therefore, the arena owner announced that the main character would not be sent back to the slave cells, but would be temporarily placed in a closed wing of the arena, under guard and away from prying eyes until the guild decides how best to present its new trophy to the world, as a monster, a hero, or a scarecrow for other rebels. The protagonist nodded, accepting this condition as well. Instead of fear, he felt a strange, dry curiosity, mixed with a persistent premonition that saved him from despair in the arena. If this world has decided to turn him into a walking bet, he will at least try to choose for himself which outcome the highest bets will be placed on. One of the guards emerged from the shadows, ready to escort the protagonist to a new, more privileged prison. At that moment, the owner of the arena, as if remembering an important detail, paused his gaze and calmly inquired what the main character felt in that very 100th second when the world around him stopped. The question did not sound like empty curiosity, but like a test. In the eyes of the arena's master, hidden behind the slits of his mask, a genuine interest protagonist flared. That rare fire for which such people are ready to spend years, gold, and other people's lives, just to touch the mythical essence of things, even through someone else's skin. The protagonist withstood this gaze and, after a short pause, answered honestly that at that moment he felt neither fear nor anger. Only a flawless, icy clarity in which the whole world narrowed down to a single line of impact, and everything else, including his own life, became nothing more than a small number in the equation. The arena master's mask lifted slightly, as if he were smiling faintly, and a satisfied "excellent" sounded in his voice. He slowly said that it is precisely such people who become true legends, or the most convenient knives with which to cut those who interfere with the creation of new legends. The guard made a sign to leave, and before the protagonist could take the first step towards the door, the arena owner added that beneath the city, among abandoned halls and sealed altars, something has been stirring for a long time, something that is also looking for a host. Perhaps it will no longer be possible to prevent their meeting. These words hung in the air like a heavy hint that could not be brushed aside. Their aftertaste was at once a warning, a threat, and a promise of power, before which even a mythical blow in the arena can seem like just a prelude to a real game unfolding beyond human stakes. The protagonist stepped towards the door, feeling the invisible seal on his wrist tremble slightly, as if testing the first step of a new connection. At that moment, deep inside, beneath the cold clarity and weary resignation, a quiet thought sounded clearly for the first time. If this world is truly looking for a knife in him, he intends to choose who he will cut first with that blade. Chapter 3. The corridors of the closed wing of the arena were a stark contrast to the damp prison passages. The stone here was polished to a matte shine, and the torches were replaced by the even light of magical lamps, and the smells of blood and mold were replaced by a spicy mixture of incense and medicinal herbs. The guard who accompanied the disciple after the audience walked half a step ahead, not doubting that the disciple would follow him anywhere. On his wrist, the disciple wore a black seal plate, an invisible hoop, and in every step he took one could feel the confidence of a man accustomed to the fact that here ropes are more important than locks. They stopped in front of a massive, unadorned door on which was a small plaque with the name of the combat asset master, a man who sharpens people into weapons. The guard knocked briefly in a special rhythm, and almost immediately a quiet, irritated response was heard from inside, as if the mentor had been distracted from an important matter for the sake of a new, dubious toy imposed from above. There was no luxury inside, but a neat, almost ascetic order reigned. The walls were lined with dark wood. There were several racks of weapons, training dummies, cut down to a wooden skeleton, and a long table, littered with scrolls, body maps, and energy flow diagrams, all with complex, intertwined lines written in colored ink. The mentor was sitting at the table, a middle-aged man with gray hair pulled back into a ponytail and narrow eyes, in the depths of which a tired, tenacious attention shone. His face was covered with fine wrinkles, and old scars were visible on his hands, saying that he himself had once held a sword no worse than his current charges. The mentor looked up from the unrolled scroll and, without getting up, slowly looked at the student with an appraising glance, similar to the cold, calculating gaze of a craftsman deciding whether to repair a cracked blade or simply melt it down. The guard briefly reported who he had brought and what orders had been given from above, after which he turned around and left, leaving the mentor and the disciple alone in a room where each object had its own strictly designated place and did not tolerate chaos. The mentor was silent for a while, as if checking how long the guest could endure the pause, then slowly stood up. His movements were economical and precise, and one could easily recognize the school of man in them, who spent years honing not only his punches, but every step between them. The mentor came closer, stopped at arm's length, and, without touching, ran his gaze over the emaciated body of the disciple, lingering on the collarbones and shoulders, thin wrists, as if reading someone else's biography, and the number of times this body has already been on the verge of breaking through the bones and muscles. The mentor's gaze lingered on the wrist, where a black seal plate was barely noticeable against the skin. A short, almost imperceptible smile flickered in the corners of his eyes. The mentor didn't need to explain that such a mark turns a person into expensive tableware, beautiful, but breakable and very demanding to care for. The mentor did not ask about feelings or motives. He dryly ordered the disciple to turn around, lift his shirt, and slowly take a few steps in a circle. And he sat back down at the table, taking a pen in his hand, as if he was not going to talk, but to write a report on the status of the next combat model. The student obeyed, feeling the inexorable gaze of the mentor. Every movement was difficult. The muscles responded with a dull pain after the flash of mythical power, and even simple steps on the flat floor seemed more tiring than the mad dash in the arena when the world became a paper backdrop. The mentor silently wrote down on parchment the height, estimated weight, condition of the muscular corset, signs of malnutrition, and general exhaustion. Each line turned the disciple into a set of characteristics in which there was less and less room for a real person. When the mentor had finished the external examination, he motioned for the disciple to sit on a low bench in the middle of the room and calmly asked her to tell him. How exactly did that flash of power feel? Not in poetic images, but in specific details. What changed in the body, how the thought moved, how the world reacted. The mentor asked precise questions without unnecessary embellishment, and the apprentice answered just as dryly as he had before to the master of the arena, paying more attention to the nuances. The student spoke of a silence that swallowed up the sound, of how the heaviness of the sword disappeared, leaving only the pure sensation of line, and how the mana bar collapsed to zero the moment the blade finished moving. The mentor was silent, listening, but his hand with a pen quickly drew diagrams on the scroll, where thin, sinuous lines, denoting flows of power, merged into a single, almost impossible configuration. All the power was concentrated not in the arms or legs, but in a tiny, fragile knot in the center of the chest. Having finished recording, the mentor thought for a moment, then quietly noted that such a concentration of power in an instant was both a gift and a curse. A body that is not prepared for such stress easily breaks down from the inside. If the apprentice wants to last longer in this world, he will have to not only sharpen the blade, but also strengthen the scabbard. The student nodded, understanding that by sheath the teacher meant his own body, and that without the enhancement of the flesh, each new attempt to use a mythical skill will be like trying to put an old, dried-out hilt on the blade of a divine sword. The mentor walked over to one of the weapon racks and took out a simple but well-balanced wooden sword, and the student threw it, forcing him to raise his hand and catch the projectile before it hit the floor. This movement already showed the first test, how quickly the ligaments and nerves react after a burst of exhaustion. The student barely managed to grab the wooden weapon. His fingers trembled, but the sword remained in his hand. The mentor acknowledged this with a slight nod and announced that from now on, iron would only be issued in special cases. For now, all training will take place on a tree, so as not to break something fragile and expensive. Then came the first exercise. The teacher ordered the student to stand in the basic stance, which he remembered well from those times, when this game was for him a set of commands on the screen and repeating one simple movement dash, swing from top to bottom, until the muscles themselves begin to remember the correct angle and pressure. The first dozen blows were relatively easy, but soon my shoulders began to hum, my back began to ache, and my breathing became ragged. And each new attempt seemed harder than the previous one, as if the wooden sword was slowly turning into a lead crowbar, deliberately stretching the boundaries of the student's patience. The mentor did not interfere, only occasionally correcting the position of the feet or the tilt of the body with short, harsh comments, from which it became clear he doesn't believe in miracles built only on talent. For the mentor, any gift without support in the craft is just a beautifully decorated crack. When the apprentice's hands finally went numb and the swing turned into a pathetic parody of a blow, the mentor raised his hand, stopping the exercise, and calmly ordered him to lower the sword. He then signaled to one of his servants, who was quietly present in the shadows, to bring herbal infusion and some potions for recovery. The student sat down on the bench with difficulty, feeling every muscle beneath his clothes pulsate with a dull pain. But instead of irritation or despair, he felt a strange satisfaction. After that icy, inhuman clarity of the mythical blow, the disciple awoke in a new body, and it was almost gratifying to sense in him the simple, honest weariness of a living person. The mentor sat down opposite, crossing his arms over his chest, and calmly explained that the purpose of training is not for the apprentice to be able to keep his monstrous skill active longer. On the contrary, they will learn to kill and survive without relying on him to do it every time. When it comes to using force, it's a thoughtful, well-reasoned decision, not a panicked attempt to escape a trap. The mentor explained in detail how mythical abilities broke people in the past. Those who relied on them too often burned out like candles, burning out not only their muscles, but their minds as well. Their names were added to the list of cautionary tales used to scare new recruits. The mentor noted that the protagonist's mythical ability is an anomaly even among those who practice such magic. Usually, high star rating means not only power, but also a wide range of instruments. While his power was a narrow, but absolutely impenetrable blade that could only be used once. The mentor emphasized that such one-time talents are especially valued by those who conduct business in the shadows. Hired assassins, church special forces, and secret orders prefer weapons that are untraceable and disappear as quickly as they appear. The mentor explained that therefore the main character should prepare for that the guild will send him not only to the arena, but also to places where the noise of the crowd does not reach, into abandoned temples, underground vaults, and special rooms, where other people's secrets are sometimes more valuable than the lives of entire neighborhoods. The protagonist took this without much surprise, since he had already seen similar talents used in hidden quests and sidelines in the game. However, now that it was about his own body and his own neck, this knowledge has ceased to be fascinating extraneous information and has turned into a chain of very specific risks. The first day of training lasted a long time. After sword exercises came practicing steps, weight distribution, and breathing work. By the end of the lesson, the main character was feeling dizzy not only from fatigue, but also from the volume of information that had to be laid on top of the existing world world map. When the mentor allowed him to go to the designated restroom, the protagonist barely made it to the narrow bunk by the wall, and without undressing, he collapsed on her, burying his face in the rough sheet that smelled of herbs. At that very moment, he fell into a heavy, empty, dreamless sleep, as if the world had turned it off for a while to give the muscles a chance not to tear. Waking up from a light knock on the door, the protagonist sat up with difficulty and realized that the room had become darker. Judging by the dim light from the corridor, the day was already drawing to an end. The body, although it ached, no longer felt like a foreign, decrepit shell. Deep in the muscles there lived a weak, but real response to yesterday's stress. The mentor's servant stood behind the door, who politely informed him that he was allowed to rest today, but that classes would resume tomorrow at dawn. And if he wants to live longer than another hundredth of a second, he better not be late even for a breath. The protagonist nodded, closed the door, and paused for a moment at the small barred window overlooking the narrow courtyard. From there came the muffled sound of metallic blows and the cries of gladiators training, and in this chorus of other people's efforts, he heard his own hard-won echo. Before lying down again, the protagonist opened the internal status window with a familiar gesture. The strength and endurance indicators slightly trembled from the initial unit, hinting at that even the simplest exercises in this world give a different return than mindlessly pressing keys on an old chair in front of a monitor. The mana scale was still pathetic, and the mythical skill hung like a motionless, predatory line, ready to collapse his life at any moment if he decided to use it without insurance. However, now he had a chance to one day make this choice consciously. He closed his eyes, allowing the fatigue to wash over him again. Half asleep, it seemed to him that somewhere in the depths of the huge stone complex, beneath the arena halls and training rooms, something was wrong. Under the ground there seemed to be a dull, slow pulse moving, belonging neither to the city nor to the guild. The feeling was faint, almost elusive, but every time he fell asleep it became a little clearer, as if an invisible hand from below was knocking on the foundation of the world from which he had been torn out and calling specifically to him. Someone who, for just a moment, saw the world in a cold, mercilessly clear light. As he slowly fell into sleep, where the remnants of pain mixed with the echoes of the voices of the mentor and the master of the arena. Deep under the stone, in one of the long-sealed halls, the ancient pattern on the floor briefly flashed with a dim light, as if in response to the rhythm of a mythical blow that had already once split the usual course of events. The morning in the closed wing of the arena was no different from the night, except for the shade of light in the magic lamps. There were no windows through which one could understand how much time had passed, and the only measure of the day became the ringing blows of sticks on tripods and short, sharp commands from the mentors, raising their charges from their beds. The protagonist woke up without a feeling of rest, as if during the night the pain in his body had simply been carefully transferred from one muscle to another. The usual feeling of dull ache was replaced by something else. Deep in his chest and limbs there was a faint, stubborn warmth, as if the body tissue had finally begun to perceive the new loads not as torture, but as a long, painful adaptation. The door to the room opened without knocking, and the mentor appeared on the threshold with the same expression of tired concentration. But this time a slight displeasure flashed in his gaze, hidden under the usual mask of discipline. The mentor briefly ordered them to get ready and follow him, without explaining whether this would be another training session or something else. Already in the corridor, where the walls seemed a little colder than usual, the mentor added that the guild decided not to wait for the end of the preparatory cycle and to test the main character in action earlier than he would have liked. These words sounded like a diagnosis, sooner than one would like, coming from a person accustomed to measuring life by activities and wounds, meant that the decision came from above, and arguing with it is not only pointless, but also dangerous. The mentor only conveyed the sentence, but did not sign it. Their path led not to the training halls, but to a distant, rarely used corridor, where the air was heavier and the torches burned dimmer, as if the fire also did not like to illuminate what was happening in these places, preferring to burn the shadow rather than the truth. At the inconspicuous door, almost merging with the stone wall, two people were already waiting for them. The guild courier, wearing a simple but expensive cloak, holds a small metal box in his hands, and Lauren, a man in a long gray cloak, casting a thick shadow on his face, in which attentive, calm eyes clearly sparkled. The mentor was the first to break the silence, briefly addressing Lauren, whose name carried a special weight, the one that appears in the voice when they are not talking about an official or a merchant, and about someone who can change the course of someone's life with one movement, sometimes irreversibly. Lauren, without removing his hood, turned his head slightly in their direction and nodded briefly, fixing his gaze on the main character. There was no emotion or prejudice in his gaze. It was the look of a swordsman who was used to judging people by how they held themselves in the moment before a fight, and not by other people's stories or legends. The courier with the metal box hurriedly stepped forward, placed the container on the nearest table by the wall, and, throwing back the lid, showed the contents. A map of the city's lower canals, several rolled-up scrolls with guild seals, and a small, inconspicuous black box with no visible locks. The mentor gestured to the map, and and dryly explained the essence of the task. In one of the old sections of underground canals, long since withdrawn from public use, the guild has discovered the activity of a group that does not recognize their authority or the city's order. This activity needed to be tested without causing any noise upstairs. Officially, this was described as an inspection of old branches and cleaning out a spy nest, but in fact, the guild was interested in the strange, unstable bursts of energy that had been emanating from there for a week. These bursts did not fit into any known school of magic, and the guild wanted to understand whether this was a coincidence with the emergence of a new mythical talent. The essence of the order was simple and merciless. The main character, two more fighters from among the proven gladiators, and an escort in the person of Lauren were supposed to go down the canals, reach the designated point, determine what is happening there, and, if necessary, eliminate those who decided to play with forces that do not belong to this city. The main character listened, and internally everything fell into place. Too quick an interest in his mythical ability, too hasty a decision to test it in action. All this added up to one simple conclusion. The guild not only wanted to use it as a weapon, but also to find out, had his actions in the arena opened the door to something they had long suspected but could not reach themselves? Lauren, who had been standing silently a little to the side until then, finally spoke in a calm, low voice without unnecessary intonations, comparable to the steel on the table. He clarified that they were forbidden from using major spells or staging demonstration battles down there, so as not to collapse the old vaults and attract unnecessary attention. Lauren then turned to the newbie and added that his mythical skill should remain in reserve until then, until a situation arises where you can't do without it. Any premature use will be recorded as unreliability of the carrier, and the guild does not hold on to unreliable assets for long. The mentor handed the novice a short, well-balanced sword, explaining that it would be his primary weapon for the sortie. It was an honest, working blade, not a rusty crowbar from the arena or a training stick, capable of withstanding at least a couple of collisions with whatever might live in the old tunnels. The newcomer gripped the sword's hilt, feeling the correct weight and distribution of metal, and almost automatically checked the balance, recalling hundreds of similar checks in the game. There it was just a game of numbers, but here this simple movement could have an impact. Will the sword slip out of his hand the moment he decides to take the impossible step? The two experienced gladiators, who had been standing silently by the wall, moved closer. Their bodies were covered with muscle over the scars, like new, rough armor. There was no irony in their eyes towards the newcomer, but rather a wary interest in the one who had so suddenly disrupted their usual hierarchy. One of the fighters, the taller one, grinned at the corner of his mouth and noted that, according to rumors, this newcomer could kill as well as he could breathe. However, looking closely at the newbie's thin body, he frowned, trying to reconcile the legend of a mythical blow with the appearance that seemed broken by the wind. Lauren cut off any unnecessary conversation with a short, sharp remark and, without wasting any more words, headed towards the far staircase leading down. The others, including Newbie, followed him. Each step down the stone seemed to tear them away from the world of light and sound, turning into a small group of shadows descending to meet something that preferred to live in the depths. As we descended, the air became colder and damper. The walls became covered with shiny mold, and the light of the magical lamps gradually gave way to the dim glow of old crystals, whose magic had long since faded, but still maintained the remnants of the spells that powered this forgotten floor of the city. The smells changed. First, the incense and kitchen smells disappeared. Then the familiar aromas of sweat and iron disappeared. Their place was taken by a heavy, stagnant moisture with a light, barely perceptible taste of rancidity. It seemed that in the depths of the tunnels, not only wood and rags had been rotting for many years, but also the very memory of those who descended here. The newcomer walked, listening to his own breathing and measured steps, constantly feeling the faint but persistent tingling of the guild seal on his wrist. The tingling was like an invisible hand holding an invisible leash, testing to see if he was getting too used to the illusion of independent movement. The canals greeted them not with the smooth corridors familiar to the game, but with a chaotic interweaving of passages, arches, and passages. The water, which once ran in turbulent streams, now froze in black, oily puddles covered with a thin film of mold. In some places the bottom was strewn with fragments of old grates and the bones of small animals. The map they had been given upstairs seemed crude and not precise enough for this labyrinth, but Lauren moved confidently, only occasionally checking the markings on the walls. These marks might have looked like random scratches if he hadn't known how exactly they are left by people who are accustomed to walking the line between what is permitted and what is forgotten. The deeper they descended, the stronger the feeling became that the air had a life of its own. At times it felt like he was being sucked into an invisible funnel, creating pressure surges that made his ears pop, and a cold sweat appeared on the skin, not connected with either effort or fear. The newcomer increasingly caught himself noticing that the internal rhythm of his steps and breathing was involuntarily adjusting to some other, low, barely perceptible pulsation. This alien dimension did not come from the people nearby, but from the very start stone womb through which they moved. Lauren noticed that newbie had slowed his pace slightly, glanced at him briefly, and quietly warned him not to listen to the stone too closely. The old tunnels love to whisper to those who are too sensitive, and have already taken dozens of magicians under their control, who decided that they heard the call of something great and not the hunger of old seals. These words did not manage to calm the newbie down. Rather, they made the strange sensation even more acute. He forced himself to focus on the specific, on the hoarse breathing of the fighters behind, on the soft rustle of Lauren's cloak in front, on the weight of the sword in his hands, and on that, so that each step would fall exactly where, under a layer of dirt, there was still stone and not a rotten void. After some time, the narrow corridor widened, turning into something like an old distribution hall. High arches receded into the darkness. The walls were covered with faded, almost erased symbols and warning signs, which were once intended to deter careless city workers from descending into more ancient levels. In the center of the hall stood a massive, long-dried bowl, along the edges of which traces of past rituals were visible. Streaks of wax, charred edges, remnants of old flowers, and crushed amulets. Above the bowl, a network of cracked crystals hung on the ceiling, once a source of light and energy, but now only humming faintly with an excess of stagnant power. Lauren stopped, raised his hand for silence, and everyone froze, holding their breath. Only now did he hear another sound in the depths of the hall. Not the air passing through the cracks, and not the rare drip of water, but a dull, measured whisper in which the words merged into a continuous, viscous thread. This whisper did not resemble any known prayer or spell. It didn't have the usual rhythm of human speech, only a strange, drawn-out melody, as if someone were speaking not with words, but with the pauses between them. This sent a chill down newbie's spine, unrelated to the physical cold of the tunnel. Lauren pulled a small crystal from under his cloak, which began to glow with a dim, calm light. He raised the crystal to his lips and whispered a short message upward. They have found the supposed source of the bursts, are going down lower. The connection may be lost. The further decision is up to the guild. With these words, Lauren led them forward to one of the arches, where on the floor, among the dust and debris, a fresh, carefully cleaned area was visible. A circle without a trace of centuries of plaque. In the center of the circle, there was a dark descent leading even deeper to where, according to old maps, there should no longer be anything living. The newcomer, looking into this opening, felt how the invisible pulse in the stone became louder and more distinct. Down below, in the belly of the city, something was really beating, like a heart. But this heart, it felt like, it belonged neither to man nor to beast, but to something much more ancient, which perhaps never considered itself part of this world. Lauren gave the newbie a quick, assessing glance, as if checking to see if he would break down under the pressure of the stranger's presence. Then the mentor was the first to step onto the narrow staircase carved out of stone. The others, including the newbie, followed him, feeling how each new meter down tore them away from everything familiar that remained above. The staircase seemed endless. Narrow, uneven steps spiraled into the darkness, and each step echoed dryly in the stone, as if the tunnel itself was listening to the one who dared to go down there, where no one had burned torches or lamps for a long time. The light from their crystals only revealed from the darkness the next few steps and a part of the wall covered with ancient, barely discernible symbols. Among them were strange signs that did not look human, as if they had been burned with hot claws rather than a chisel. The lower they went, the stronger the dull pulse became in the depths of the stone. Now it could no longer be written off as a figment of the imagination. Subtle vibrations echoed in the soles of the feet. The sound was barely perceptible in the chest, like a distant but steady beat of a huge heart hidden under layers of rock. One of the fighters behind him swore quietly through his teeth. Even through this restrained whisper, it was clear that he was gripped not by fear of a specific enemy, but by a sticky, an irrational feeling that they were being led not to living enemies, but to the very reason for the dark stories about the cursed tunnels. At last the stairs ended, leading them into a wide, low passage, the ceiling of which was supported by massive, roughly hewn columns. The air here was almost still and so dense that each breath came with a slight resistance, as if passing through an invisible fabric. The light from the crystals that Lauren possessed shattered against the walls and dissolved into the thick darkness, preventing one from seeing the far corners of the room. In the very center of the room, there was a circle of stone slabs, perfectly fitted together and covered with unfamiliar, intersecting lines, forming a complex, nervous pattern. On this circle, sitting on their knees, were several figures in dark robes. Their faces were hidden by hoods. Their hands were stretched forward with palms towards the stone, and their lips moved in unison. A drawn-out rhythm that sent a cold, sticky, goosebump-like fire running across my skin, making the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. The whispers Lauren had heard in the upper hall were now clearer. Individual words were still incomprehensible, but the structure of the sounds clearly suggested that it was not human speech, but a strange, leisurely flow in which each word stretched out over several heartbeats. Something similar to smoke, but darker, heavier, and more viscous, was swirling in the air above the circle. This mass did not rise rise to the ceiling, but stretch downwards, towards the center of the pattern, as if someone was trying to extend a hand from the depths of the stone, and people with their voices and postures served as guides for him. Lauren raised his hand, signaling for them to stop, and all four froze in the shadow of the columns. He leaned forward, peering closely at what was happening. The tension in the muscles in his neck showed that even to him, who had seen much, this scene did not seem familiar or safe. Lauren explained that this was not just a gathering of rebels or sectarians, but an attempt to break into the old printing circle, which the guild had once deliberately left untouched, not daring to destroy what had existed here long before the city was founded. The memory of the faint flash of the pattern beneath the arena as Lauren fell asleep in his room made him cringe inside. He realized that the distant heartbeat beneath the city and the pattern on the floor were connected through an ancient, human-unfriendly mechanism. Lauren outlined the task briefly. First, the living had to be removed from the circle, quickly and quietly, before the ritual reached the point of no return. He will then try to restore the seal at least partially in order to stop the leakage of alien power into the city. If that fails, they may have to run as fast as they came down. He added that if whatever they disturbed went beyond the circle, his mythical ability can become the only barrier between the alien force and the rest of the world. However, Lauren warned that this would be the only chance, after which he might not even have time to save himself. Lauren pulled from his belt a thin, almost mastless sword with a blade so narrow that it seemed to consist of only the tip. The blade did not reflect the light of the crystals, but absorbed it, becoming a dark, barely noticeable line sliding through the air. He gestured for one of the fighters to take a position on the left, and for the other to take a position on the left, on the right, and he nodded towards the column, from where the most direct path to those who stood closest to the edge of the circle opened up. Their task was simple in formulation and monstrously difficult in execution: to tear out the supports of the ritual before it collapsed. The fighters moved forward, gliding from shadow to shadow. Their boots stepped softly on the stone, each trying to keep their breathing on a short, controlled leash, so that not a single extra sound would betray their presence before the swords had done their work. The closer the fighters got to the circle, the louder the strange noise in their ears became. To the whisper of the ritual was added a barely audible but obsessive hum, as if somewhere behind the wall a huge one was working. An ancient machine that has long forgotten its purpose, but still turns gears by inertia. Lauren's heart beat faster, but not from fear of the people ahead. They were only pitiful, trembling conduits of someone else's will. He realized that whatever they were approaching had already responded to his presence once, and had perhaps been waiting for this moment just as he had. The first of the fighters reached the edge of the circle, and without hesitation delivered a sharp chopping blow to the neck of the nearest spellcaster. He didn't have time to scream. His body collapsed like a cut thread, and his voice broke off, giving way to a short, hoarse sigh. Almost simultaneously, the second fighter slashed at the back of the other figure, severing the spine and breaking his posture. Lauren darted towards the center like a shadow, his sword piercing the third one's throat in a barely noticeable arc. A thin stream of blood flowed down his chin and disappeared into the folds of his robe, giving away what had happened. Lauren chose the moment and struck the man who remained on the edge of the circle. The wooden sound of a body being cut, mixed with a strange dull echo from the stone, reverberated in his bones like that it seemed as if he was cutting not at the flesh, but at the root of something that had grown into the hall for centuries. The ritual whisper did not stop immediately. For a few more seconds, it seemed as if the words continued to sound on their own, without human voices, as if the echo of an ancient spell wandered through the vaults, refusing to acknowledge the silence of its bearers. The smoky shadow above the circle twitched as if alive, and froze for a moment, turning into a strange, shapeless mass. Inside it, two dim crimson lights flashed, looking at them with a cold, inhuman interest, inherent to those who are accustomed to seeing people as a short flash on a long timeline. The stone ritual circle under the feet of the whisperers began to glow faintly from within. The lines of the pattern flashed with a dim, sickly light. Lauren, cursing out loud, rushed to the center, trying to block sections of the seal with gestures and short, abrupt spells. Where the power began to leak out, like water from a cracked vessel. He saw how the skin on his hands became covered with a thin network of cracks from contact with this light, how thin dark veins crawled along his wrists. But he did not stop, considering any price lower than what would have to be paid if the pulse deep in the stone broke out to the surface. The smoky shadow stirred again, and from it burst forth a thin, almost intangible tentacle-like appendage, more like a shadow than matter. He reached out not to the fighters, but to Lauren, as to the one who had already once answered his call. The moment the tentacle almost touched Lauren's chest, the seal on his wrist flared with a searing pain, as if the metal under his skin had been heated to red heat. Lauren reflexively clenched his teeth to keep from screaming, and all the cards flashed in his head. Diagrams and scraps of knowledge about mythical abilities that he managed to collect. He realized that if he pulled back now or tried to fight off the tentacle with his sword, the force under the seal would perceive this as a refusal and weakness, and would reach out further. To the city, the people, the arena, repeating the call until it finds a more obedient bearer. The pulse in the stone matched the beat of his heart, and in that resonance Lauren clearly heard the familiar icy silence, which was inside him at the moment when he cut the gladiator's throat in the arena. Now this silence demanded a decision that could not be undone. He felt the hilt of the sword in his hand become lighter, like a mythical skill that had been dormant deep beneath his mana bar. Wakes up, responding to someone else's call, and ready to once again cut the world into before and after. The price for this will be higher than just a depleted energy bar. Meanwhile, Lauren, busy with printing, began to lose the fight. The light in the patterns was increasingly bursting out, the smoke was becoming denser, and the crimson lights inside it were now looking not only at Lauren, but also for the entire hall, assessing the amount of living flesh and will. The scene shrank to a few moments. A smoky tentacle reached towards Lauren's chest, the seal on his wrist burned, the pulse in the stone merged with his heart, and the world around dissolved into that very glassy silence, calling for one single, flawless movement. Lauren realized that if he allowed the shadow to enter him, the world might stop demanding such a cruel price for every breath he exhaled. But then he will no longer have to choose who to hit and when. If he breaks forward once again, cutting not a person, but the very thread of someone else's power, he may not have a single chance left for his own future. The moment the smoky tentacle touched the air a couple of fingers from Lauren's chest, his mythical skill unfolded like a knife, piercing straight into the enemy's chest. It did not wait for a command, but awaited the final consent, after which it would be impossible to take a step back or breathe without bleeding. At the moment when the smoky shadow almost touched the protagonist's chest, the world finally split into two realities. In one, heavy and viscous, the stone hummed from the pressure of an alien force. Lauren wheezed, holding the spreading seal, and the fighters tightly gripped the hilts of their swords. In another reality, time stopped. The light of the crystals stretched into thin threads and froze, leaving the hall in a strange, half-dead light, where every movement became too obvious. The protagonist felt a mythical skill unfolding inside him, beneath his ribcage, like a red-hot blade trying to break free from its sheath. The mana bar in the corner of his mind flared and then collapsed, but this time the devastation didn't stop the process. The force stopped paying attention to numbers, taking into account only his consent. The smoky tentacle, frozen a few fingers away from him, changed its appearance. It turned from a shapeless gray stream into a thin, almost perfect line cutting through the space between the stone's circle and the protagonist's chest. In the center of this line, deep beneath a layer of murky shadow, a tiny dark scarlet dot flickered, like a pupil dilating as one gazed. The protagonist realized that he could retreat, one slight movement back, and the line would pass by, hitting Lauren, the fighters, and the city. Or he could step forward, allowing the dot to enter him, forever blurring the line between who he was and who something living in the stone now wants to make him. The inner voice of the protagonist, accustomed to calculating options, coldly warned that any of the decisions would be defeat. In one case, everything he built in this world will perish. In another, he will turn into a conductor of power that neither the guild nor common sense will trust. At the edge of choice, a third option was born, crazy and illogical, but the only one that did not give him either himself or the city entirely. The protagonist decided not to retreat or accept, but to cut the connection itself, striking not at people or at himself, but at the thin thread that connected someone else's heart with the stone circle. He gripped the hilt of the sword, and there was no usual heaviness in this movement. The blade became weightless, like a thought. The world has narrowed to one line dash, the one that stretched from the smoky tentacle down into the depths of the pattern, to the point of intersection of all the lines of the seal, marked with ancient, barely noticeable symbols. The body, exhausted by training and the descent, disappeared. Only the ideal geometry of the blow remained. A step forward, a turn of the body, a short, almost imperceptible swing, and a sharp, perfectly straight lunge, devoid of anger and fear, filled with a cold, pure intent to tear apart what should not exist at this depth. The sword's blade passed through the smoky shadow without resistance, as if cutting not matter but thought, and simultaneously struck the stone in the center of the pattern. The sound that arose at that moment did not resemble either the ringing of metal or the cracking of stone. It was a sharp, tearing squeak from within, as if somewhere deep underground someone had squeezed a living thread in their fist. The lines of the seal flashed with a blinding white light, cruel and cutting, instantly breaking the frozen silence and returning distorted sound to the world. The screams, the rumble of falling rocks, and the muffled roar of the creature awakening beneath them merged into a deafening canvas. The shock waved through the protagonist's back like a doll. He felt the air hit his chest, burning his lungs from the inside. The wall that met his back cracked, showering his shoulders with dust and small fragments. The eyes were momentarily blinded by the white afterglow of the pattern still burning on the inside of the eyelids. A dull roar rolled through the hall. The columns shook, and heavy stone slabs fell from the ceiling. One of them fell next to Lauren, scattering into dust. The other hit one of the fighters, who, with a short, hoarse cry, disappeared under an avalanche of stone and dust. The smoke hanging above the circle burst as if it it had been squeezed out by a palm. The crimson lights inside him flickered, compressed into a bright, red-hot splash, and rushed towards the main character with furious speed, passing through the chest like a needle through fabric, leaving the sensation of a wound burned from the inside. The protagonist did not hear his own scream. The world again plunged into a deep, unreal silence for a moment. Instead of thoughts, alien images flashed in my head. Collapsed vaults of ancient halls, corridors flooded with inky water, a huge motionless shadow sleeping under the thickness of stone, and thin glowing chains entangling this shadow. The next moment, everything ended. The protagonist realized that he was lying on a cold stone, pressed to the floor by the weight of his own body and small debris. There was a ringing in my ears, as if someone was knocking out the last of my hearing with long, methodical hammer blows. Lauren was still alive. He knelt near the crumpled circle, leaning his hands on the stone. His skin was covered with a fine network of burns, and a thin stream of blood flowed from the corner of his mouth. But in his eyes burned the fierce fire of a man who was already mentally rewriting the plan and assessing the cost of risk. The second fighter was coughing against the wall, trapped between two collapsed slabs, but he was alive and still able to swear. Where the first fighter had stood before, there now lay a shapeless heap of stone, from under which not a sound could be heard. The stone circle beneath them was broken, but not destroyed. Part of the pattern was burned, part was lost in the cracks. In the center, where the sword had struck, there was a small, perfectly smooth black crater, the depth of which was beyond the scope of the eye, as if the blade cut not only the stone, but also what was underneath it. The pulse deep within the stone died down, but in its place another sensation appeared, constant, quiet, like a whisper right next to the ear. It was now coming not from below, but from within, from the chest, from the place where the crimson light had darted at the last moment. The sensation was so alien that the body involuntarily tried to push it away, like a splinter in the heart. The protagonist sat up with difficulty, gasping for breath and feeling every muscle protest. He met Lauren's gaze. There was no longer the same cold detachment in Lauren's eyes. Now there was a mixture of suspicion, relief, and wary interest, as if he was looking not at a subordinate, but at a vessel in which something was barely moving. Silence hung between them like a thick, viscous curtain until Lauren straightened up, falling into the slight but characteristic unsteadiness of a man nearly burned out from overexertion. He said in a firm, hoarse voice that they would go up immediately, before what has awakened realizes how many new hands and eyes it has. The protagonist tried to get up, and at that moment the guild seal on his wrist flashed, as if someone had pulled an invisible chain. A shock of pain rolled through my body, and in my chest, where the new alien mark was now smoldering, something responded briefly, not with agreement or protest, but with icy, almost mocking attention. The hall shook once more. Somewhere in the depths of the tunnels the old, long-cracked vaults creaked and collapsed, and a new portion of dust fell overhead. Lauren glanced quickly towards the black funnel in the center of the circle and swore quietly, almost soundlessly, recognizing that they had not so much sealed an ancient wound as made a neat, controlled incision in it. The protagonist felt a light, icy whisper pass over his skin, beneath the dirt and blood, not a sound, but a sensation. This invisible voice, alien and yet now inseparable from his breath, seemed to quietly laugh at that. What people call victory when, at best, they have managed to negotiate with the storm about which way to bend it. As they staggered toward the stairs, carrying with them one dead, one nearly broken, and one in whose chest a new one now lived. An unaccounted for force, the black funnel in the center of the broken circle twitched slightly for a moment, as if someone's claws had gently run along its edge from the depths. At that very moment, something clicked briefly in the protagonist's chest, like a lock testing a fresh key. He understood not with his mind, but with his skin. Now, beneath the city, not only the ancient heart beats, but also his own, connected to it by a thin, invisible thread, which sooner or later will require a second blow dash, no longer on stone, but on the world itself. The patient did not wake up immediately. At first he felt like he was lying at the bottom of a deep hole,